In an Iowa courtroom, this young mother was not facing a case built around one sudden moment. She was facing a case built around time, not seconds, not minutes, but days. Her 4-month-old son, Sterling Koehn, had been found in a baby swing inside the family's apartment in Alta Vista, Iowa. And from the moment first responders entered that home, the case was no longer about a simple emergency call. It became a question of how long a baby had been left without the care he needed. At first, the defense tried to give the jury another way to look at Cheyanne Harris.
There's no doubt that this case is a terrible case. It's a tragedy. You're going to wonder what kind of monster could do something like this. The monster in this case is mental health. The monster in this case is depression, postpartum, substance abuse.
But a tragic failure inside a home where a young mother had fallen apart. For a moment, that explanation may have sounded like something the jury had to consider. But then the prosecution began laying out the evidence.
Ladies and gentlemen, the actions of the defendant that you'll hear in this case will show that she placed Will Sterling in the back bedroom of that 2-bedroom apartment in Alta Vista. She placed Sterling in a swing, one of the mechanical swings that swings back and forth, the baby swing. She placed that swing against the wall in a dark, unlit room that was hot and stuffy with no air movement because it was August.
That was when the defense story began to collapse. Because this case was not only about what Cheyanne Harris said she was going through. It was about what Sterling Koehn went without: food, clean clothing, basic care, and someone willing to walk into that room before it was too late. What you are about to see is how a defense built around mental health came face to face with a timeline that prosecutors said no parent could explain away. A baby did not vanish from a public place. He was not lost in a crowd. He was inside the home where his parents lived. And that is what made this case so difficult for people to accept. Every major detail in this case has been verified through court records, trial testimony, law enforcement investigation, medical findings, and the jury's final verdict. This is one of those cases that forces a painful question. How can a child be inside a home, surrounded by adults, and still be left completely unseen? How can the smallest needs become the evidence of the largest failure? And how can a mother stand in court and ask a jury to see tragedy when the prosecution is asking them to see responsibility? In this video, we will go through the case of Cheyanne Harris and Sterling Koehn from the beginning, the family's life in Alta Vista, the 911 call, what first responders found, the medical evidence, the defense argument, the prosecution's timeline, and the verdict that ended with one of the harshest sentences under Iowa law. If you have never heard the full case before, prepare yourself, because this is not a story about one moment that went wrong. It is a story about days that passed, warning signs that were missed inside a home, and a baby whose entire life depended on the people who were supposed to protect him. To understand why Cheyanne Harris ended up in that courtroom, and why the jury rejected the defense explanation, we have to go back to August 2017 before the verdict, before the sentence, and before the truth about Sterling Koehn was finally placed in front of a jury. Sterling Koehn was born on the 1st of May 2017 in Iowa, and for nearly 4 months, his entire world existed inside the small circle of people who were supposed to keep him alive. He lived with his parents, Zachary Koehn and Cheyanne Harris, in an apartment in Alta Vista. Also inside that home was Sterling's older sister, a 2-year-old girl who, according to prosecutors, continued to receive care while her baby brother was left in a back room. On paper, it was a young family living in a small Iowa town. But behind the walls of that apartment, investigators would later uncover a case that was not built around one sudden act. It was built around days of silence, inaction, and the denial of basic care to a child who could not call for help. The apartment itself became important in court because it was not large or complicated. Records described it as a small living space, with rooms close enough that sound, smell, and movement could not easily disappear. Sterling was kept in a baby swing in a back bedroom. That room was described as hot and dark. The window was covered, and the swing faced toward the wall. It was not a place where a baby could feed himself, move himself, change himself, or escape discomfort. Sterling depended completely on the adults in that apartment for every bottle, every diaper, every bath, and every sign of comfort. In the days before the 30th of August 2017, prosecutors said Sterling remained in that swing for an extended period. The most important timeline came from forensic entomologist Dr. Timothy Huntington, who studied the insect activity connected to Sterling's clothing and body. Based on that evidence, he concluded that Sterling may have been in the same diaper and clothing for roughly 9 to 14 days, with the earliest activity beginning around August 24 or August 21. That meant the case was not about an infant being overlooked for an hour or a parent making one late response to an emergency. The state's theory was that Sterling had been left in the same place for days while his condition worsened. During that same period, the 2-year-old child in the home was still being cared for. Prosecutors used that fact carefully but forcefully. It showed, in their view, that Zachary and Cheyanne had the ability to provide care. They knew how to feed a child. They knew what diapers were for. They had formula, bottles, clean clothing, and supplies inside the home. But Sterling did not receive what he needed. The contrast between one child being cared for and Sterling being left in the back room became one of the clearest parts of the prosecution's case. On the 30th of August 2017, Zachary Koehn called 911. He reported that his infant son had died at the family apartment. No full public transcript of that call has been widely released, so the exact conversation should not be recreated. What is known is that the call brought emergency responders to the Alta Vista apartment, and one of the first people to arrive was nurse and EMT Tony Friedrich. Zachary led her to the back bedroom. The room was dark and warm. Sterling was in the baby swing. What Friedrich saw immediately raised serious concerns. This did not look like an emergency that had just happened moments earlier. Sterling's condition, the room, and the state of the swing suggested a much longer period without care. Responders noticed signs that could not be explained by a recent, sudden medical event. The apartment became a scene where medical response and criminal investigation overlapped. Sterling was no longer only a baby whose father had reported a death. He was a child whose condition demanded answers. The investigation began with the most basic question. How long had Sterling been in that swing, and what had his parents done during that time? The Iowa State Medical Examiner, Dr. Dennis Klein, performed the autopsy and concluded that Sterling died from denial of critical care. The medical findings included malnutrition, dehydration, and an E. coli infection. The infection was connected to damaged skin caused by prolonged contact with waste in an unchanged diaper. In simple terms, prosecutors argued that Sterling died because the care required to keep him alive had been withheld for days. Those medical findings became the foundation of the case. The state did not present Sterling's death as an unexplained tragedy in a crib or a sudden illness no one could have seen coming. Investigators focused on the length of time, the condition of his clothing, the insect evidence, the state of the room, and the fact that he was a small infant who could not survive without direct care. Every detail pointed toward neglect that had continued long enough to become fatal. Zachary and Cheyanne quickly became the central suspects because they were the adults living in the apartment and responsible for Sterling's care. They were arrested in October 2017 and charged with serious offenses, including first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death or causing death. Their cases were later separated for trial because each side had a different defense strategy. Zachary's defense pointed towards Cheyanne as the primary caregiver. Cheyanne's defense focused on mental health, postpartum depression, and emotional collapse. But prosecutors in both trials returned to the same central evidence. Sterling had been in that swing for days in a hot, dark room without the care he needed. During questioning, Zachary gave statements that became important later. The full interrogation transcripts were not released in standard public reporting, but the appellate record showed that his account changed over time. At one point, he said he heard Sterling crying around 6 in the morning on August 30 and believed Cheyanne had gone in to feed him. Later, he said he might have dreamed that. He also claimed he had played with Sterling the day before the death was reported and that the baby had responded to him. But the medical examiner testified that Sterling's condition would not have fit the picture of a baby who was still interacting normally at that point. Zachary also tried to explain why he did not know what was happening. He said Cheyanne was the main caregiver and that he worked long hours. But the work records did not support the image of a father who was almost never home. In the 5 days before Sterling was reported dead, Zachary worked fewer than 25 hours. Prosecutors also emphasized that the apartment was small, the rooms were close together, and Zachary himself had acknowledged he could hear Sterling cry from different parts of the home. The jury was asked to consider whether it was believable that he did not know Sterling was not being fed, changed, moved, or cleaned. Cheyanne Harris was described by the defense as a young mother struggling after childbirth. Her attorneys argued that she had postpartum depression and had been using substances to cope. They said the case was a mental health tragedy, not a planned act. One investigator testified that Harris had said she should have checked on Sterling more. But prosecutors argued that this statement could not erase the physical evidence. Sterling had not been left alone for a short period. The timeline suggested days of no meaningful care. In the same home, another child received attention. That was the fact the state returned to again and again. The case file grew stronger through multiple types of evidence. The autopsy showed the medical cause. The forensic insect analysis showed an estimated timeline. First responders described the condition of the room and the child. Work records challenged Zachary's explanation. The supplies in the home showed that formula, diapers, bottles, and clean clothing were available. The 2-year-old sibling's condition showed that care was being provided to at least one child in the apartment. Together, those facts gave prosecutors a powerful argument. Sterling's death was not caused by a lack of resources alone. It was caused by the failure to use those resources for him. Zachary Koehn's trial lasted 6 days in late October and early November of 2018. His defense did not seriously dispute that Sterling died from lack of care. Instead, the defense argued that Zachary did not know Cheyanne had stopped caring for the baby. They portrayed him as a working father who believed the mother was handling the feeding and diaper changes. But prosecutors pressed the timeline, the apartment layout, the smell, the condition of the room, and the fact that Zachary was home far more than he first suggested. They argued that he had both the ability and the duty to act. The prosecution's position was direct. A parent cannot close the door on a baby and then claim not to know. Sterling was not old enough to seek help or make noise forever. He was completely dependent. If he was hungry, someone had to feed him. If his diaper needed changing, someone had to change it. If he was sick, someone had to get medical help. Prosecutors asked jurors to look at what Zachary knew, what he could have seen, what he could have smelled, and what he failed to do. On the 6th of November 2018, the jury found Zachary Koehn guilty of first-degree murder and child endangerment resulting in death. Under Iowa law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. In December 2018, Zachary received that sentence. His conviction later went to the Iowa Court of Appeals, but in 2020, the court upheld the convictions, concluding there was enough evidence for the jury to find that he knew Sterling needed care, had the ability to provide it, and still failed to do so. Cheyanne Harris went to trial separately in early 2019. Court TV preserved the case under the title IA v. Harris, The Death of Baby Sterling. By then, the public already knew the core facts from Zachary's trial, but Harris's trial focused on her own responsibility as Sterling's mother. The defense again argued that mental health played a major role. They pointed to postpartum depression, substance use, and a young mother in crisis. They asked jurors to see the case as a tragedy caused by psychological collapse rather than intentional harm. The prosecution answered with the evidence that did not change. Sterling was found in the swing. The room was hot and dark. The window was covered. He had been left in the same diaper and clothing for many days. He died from malnutrition, dehydration, and infection linked to a lack of basic care. Another child in the home was still being cared for. The state argued that even if Harris was struggling, she still had a legal and moral duty to provide the basic care that Sterling needed to live. The jury deliberated for about 4 hours. On the 6th of February 2019, Cheyanne Harris was found guilty of first-degree murder and child endangerment causing death. The verdict showed that jurors rejected the idea that mental health explanations removed criminal responsibility. They accepted the state's argument that Sterling's death resulted from a prolonged denial of care by the people responsible for him. On the 19th of February 2019, Cheyanne Harris was sentenced in New Hampton. The court denied her request for a new trial and imposed the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Iowa, life in prison without the possibility of parole. With that sentence, both parents had been convicted and both would spend the rest of their lives in prison unless the law or courts changed their status. The legal ending was clear, but the emotional weight of the case came from the simplicity of what Sterling needed. He did not need extraordinary medical treatment at the beginning of the timeline. He needed food. He needed clean clothing. He needed to be lifted from the swing. He needed someone to notice that he was declining and call for help before it was too late. Those were ordinary tasks, but in Sterling's case, the failure to do them became the basis for 2 first-degree murder convictions. The case remains one of Iowa's most painful infant neglect prosecutions because of the contrast inside the home. In one room, a 2-year-old child was still being fed and cared for. In another room, Sterling sat in a swing facing the wall. The apartment was small. The supplies were there. The adults were there, but care did not reach him. When Zachary finally called 911 on August 30, the evidence later showed the danger had already been unfolding for many days. For investigators, the case was not solved through one dramatic confession or one hidden video. It was built through science, timelines, testimony, and contradiction. The insects helped estimate time. The autopsy explained cause. The first responders described what they saw. The work records weakened Zachary's claim that he was absent. The siblings' condition showed that parenting was happening for one child, while Sterling was left without the same attention. Each fact became a step toward the same conclusion. In the end, the Sterling Koehn case was not about poverty, confusion, or one missed feeding. It was about a baby left in a back room, dependent on parents who did not provide the care he needed to survive. It was about a 911 call made only after life had already ended. And it was about two separate juries hearing two separate defenses, then reaching the same judgment. Cheyanne Harris and Zachary Koehn were criminally responsible for the death of their infant son. The current legal status reflects that outcome. Zachary remains under a life sentence without parole after his first-degree murder conviction, and the Iowa Court of Appeals later upheld the judgment against him. Cheyanne also remains sentenced to life without parole after her separate conviction and sentencing in February 2019. The courts did not treat Sterling's death as a brief lapse or an isolated mistake. They treated it as the result of sustained inaction by two adults who had the power to provide care and did not. That is why the case continues to stand out in true crime coverage and court reporting. The facts were not complicated, but they were difficult to absorb. A baby was in a swing. A room was hot and dark. Supplies were nearby. Another child in the same home was being cared for. The 911 call came only after the outcome could no longer be changed. By the time the courtroom heard the evidence, the story had already become a record of how long neglect can last when no one steps in. The strongest message from the Sterling Koehn case is that neglect can become fatal long before anyone makes an emergency call. Sterling was not lost in a public place. He was inside his own home, in a small apartment, surrounded by adults, supplies, and the chance to act. Yet the care he needed did not reach him. By the time Zachary Koehn called 911, the evidence showed that the real emergency had been unfolding for days. The lesson is that a baby's safety cannot depend on assumptions, closed doors, or one parent believing the other is handling everything. Infants need constant care, and when that care stops, every hour matters. This case also shows that mental health struggles, work schedules, or household stress may explain pressure, but they do not erase the duty to protect a child. Sterling's story is a warning about the danger of silence inside a home. When a child cannot speak, adults must notice, respond, and seek help immediately before courts are left to count the permanent damage. The courtroom delivered punishment, but the deeper lesson is prevention. Basic care is not optional. For a helpless child, it is the line between life and irreversible loss.